Intruder. My boyfriend and I both lived in Los Angeles. It's where we met and where we'd both lived our entire lives. But something personal had happened that made us want to leave the big city life and move to somewhere quieter, somewhere with more peace. My boyfriend had gone to Maine on a business trip a few years back and fell in love with everything about small towns, the scenery, and the people. He suggested we move there. It didn't take long for me to be convinced, and we decided to pack up our entire life and move there. The plan was for me to drive the moving truck across the country while he stayed 3 days to finish up at his job. We would have just waited until he was free, but we decided to take advantage of an incredibly good deal offered to us by the company that provided the moving truck. Plus, he had a car that he had to drive there anyway, while I towed my car behind the moving truck. So, I called up my brother for help, and we left. The trip was obviously very long, and when my brother and I arrived in Maine, about 4 days after we left, we were exhausted. So after unloading the truck and sleeping for about 16 hours, we decided to visit the small town, which was about 14 miles from my new house. We ate at a small family restaurant, rented a horror movie, and drove back to the house. Now, my new house was literally in the middle of nowhere. During the day, the view of the lake in my backyard was amazing. The forests surrounding my house were stunning, and everything was really beautiful. But at night, it was a whole different story. The house was incredibly creepy, and the whole property was surrounded by windows. You couldn't see anything looking out those windows at night, but I'm sure if you were outside, you could easily see what was going on inside the house. My brother had a flight booked back to LA the next day, and we got up super early in the morning to drive to the airport. I came back alone and couldn't make any phone calls or watch cable TV because we still hadn't gotten a connection. My cell phone didn't work anywhere on that property, and the only technology I had was a DVD player. I decided to try out my new fishing rod that we had bought in town. I didn't spend much time on the lake because it would get dark very quickly in Maine in the fall. I came back to the house and sat in the living room in the chair looking out the windows. As darkness settled, I realized how isolated the house was in the middle of the woods. I turned on all the lights, trying to push away the growing unease. Without any curtains or blinds up yet, every window felt like an open invitation for anyone or anything outside to peek in. Trying to shake off that eerie feeling, I decided to hang sheets over the windows, thinking it might help. I then plopped down on the couch and put on a light-hearted movie, hoping it'd distract me from the silence outside. It didn't work. In the end, I realized that I had to try to get some sleep. My eyelids hurt and I felt very tired. I woke up a little later and it was still night and still very dark. I picked up my bottle of Coke that I had on the floor in front of me and took a big sip. As I put the bottle down again and looked around the room, my heart started pounding when I noticed a man standing in the corner of the room. I couldn't see his eyes, but he had to have been looking at me. I didn't do anything or say anything, and not by choice, but because I couldn't. He was frozen, didn't move, and it was clear that he was trying not to be seen after a few moments. I tried my best to think rationally and logically. I'm not sure he knew I had seen him because I had a blanket over my face and he couldn't see my eyes. After about a minute of gut-wrenching fear, somehow I built up the courage and decided to do something. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. But I forced myself to do it. I let out a big cough and stood up in an effort to give him the impression that I didn't know he was there. I slowly walked across the cold wooden floor to the bathroom in the corner of the living room. He didn't move. I went into the bathroom and nothing happened. I closed the bathroom door and slowly turned the lock. Tears of fear rolled down my face and my face turned bright red as I backed away into the tub behind me, constantly keeping my eyes on the door. I suddenly realized that there was a small window above the bathtub that I could probably crawl through. I moved toward the shower curtain as quietly as I could and reached for the window lock. I opened it and tried to slide the window open to the left, but as I opened the window, it started to squeak, as if it hadn't been opened in forever. I froze, hoping the man didn't hear it, but a couple of seconds later, I heard a knock on the bathroom door. It wasn't a knock, but a tap, and it didn't sound like that of a finger. It sounded like metal, like someone was scraping on the door with a knife. At that moment, I realized that the man knew what he was doing, or simply wanted me to know that he was outside the door. The adrenaline completely took over, and I slid. I opened the window and pushed the screen to the ground. I tried not to make any noise as I jumped and began to squeeze my body through this small window. My head and upper body were outside, and I could no longer see inside the bathroom, only the dense, dark forest in front of me. I was sticking my legs out the window when I suddenly felt the man grab my foot immediately after that. Before I could react, I felt my ankle being cut. I let out a scream as he tried to pull me back in, but luckily, I slipped out of his reach and fell to the ground. I started panting and felt like my heart was going to explode. I got up and looked around. I quickly ran out into the woods and fell to the ground, looking back at the house in the bathroom window. I felt my ankle throb with pain and raised my hand to reveal it was covered in a lot of blood. I looked at the house and suddenly saw the back door burst open and the man ran out. He walked up the steps and started looking around in the dark for me. But luckily, these woods were so dark at night that you could barely see your own hand if you held it out. I stood still, almost like a statue, and tried to control my breathing. He started walking towards the forest and away from me. I was lying down, and he was grunting, and shortly after I lost sight of him, I began to look around frantically, thinking that at any moment he would see me and stab me to death. I saw nothing but trees and darkness. There was a little snow on the ground a couple of days before, and I was freezing and shivering uncontrollably at this point. About 10 minutes later, I saw the man come out of the trees where he went in and go back inside the house. I stayed out there the rest of the night, and luckily the sun started to come up soon. After the sun had completely illuminated my surroundings, I felt like the man was probably gone, and I felt ready to move. I stood up and walked around the house towards the front. I saw that the front door was open. I left it completely open. I approached slowly and looked inside. Nothing. I walked a few steps and grabbed my car keys that were hanging on a hook by the front door. I ran to my car and opened it. I got in and started the engine. I left in reverse. Out of the long driveway, drove to the small general store a few miles from my house and called for help. My ankle was cut pretty badly, but it healed after a few months with no problems. I suffered mild pneumonia from being outside during the time I was there, but nothing too serious happened. The house high school is supposed to be about friends, crushes, and sneaking past curfew. For me, though, there was another layer to it. Haunting memories that were not my own. My mother always said our house was alive, that it remembered things from the past. Houses have souls too, she'd muse. But to my teenage brain, it just sounded like the same kind of stuff you'd hear in a campfire story. As time passed, I became accustomed to hearing random sounds. Sometimes they were harmless, like faint whispers from a bygone era or a gentle tapping on the window pane. It felt almost as though the house was singing to itself, lost in some reverie. Mom said these were echoes, remnants of the people who'd lived there before us. She'd often say she saw and heard things, faces from the past, voices of long-gone children. Dad and I dismissed it as her overactive imagination. Then, one day, the echoes got louder. It was an ordinary evening, and I was the only one home. After a particularly tiring day at school, I decided to take a long shower. As the hot water relaxed my tired muscles, I let my mind wander. But as I was lost in thought, a familiar rustling sound came from outside the bathroom. Mom must be back from shopping, I figured. The sounds continued, and it felt comforting to know I wasn't alone in the house. After I finished my shower, I began to brush my teeth, the door slightly open to let the steam out. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of the fridge door closing. Exiting the bathroom, I headed to my room, my thoughts on my day. I was halfway through picking out my clothes when the noises from the kitchen persisted. They must have bought half the store, I muttered, chuckling to myself. As I dressed, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread enveloped me. My heart started to race. I told myself it was silly to feel this way, but the feeling persisted. Once ready, I hesitated, listening intently. The kitchen was silent now. With a deep breath, I decided to face my fears and headed toward the kitchen, expecting to find my parents sorting out groceries. But the kitchen was empty. No bags, no new groceries, just the familiar hum of the refrigerator. Panic began to creep in. Where were the sounds coming from? I tried to rationalize. Maybe my parents had come home and then left again? But a quick scan of the driveway through the window revealed no car. Feeling cornered and vulnerable, I stepped out of the house, the crisp evening air helping to clear my head a little. The street was quiet, with only the distant sound of a dog barking. Desperate for some sort of normalcy, I grabbed my bike and pedaled as fast as I could to my friend Dave's house. Once there, I called my parents. They were both at my sister's place. The realization was bone-chilling. I wasn't imagining things, and I wasn't alone in the house earlier. Dave could see the terror in my eyes. "What happened?" he probed. I recounted the events, and as the story unfolded, the weight of it began to sink in for both of us. Days turned into weeks, but I couldn't shake off the experience. Every time I was home alone, every creak, every whisper would make my heart race. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it was filled with nightmares. Shadows would flit across my room, and distant murmurs would echo through the walls. My grades began to suffer, and I grew distant from my friends. Every conversation seemed trivial compared to the terror I felt every day. My parents, worried about my well-being, considered moving. But where do you go when you're running from shadows? We moved soon after, but the experience never left me. Some nights, when the wind howls and the shadows dance, I remember the rustling of bags, the feeling of not being alone, and the haunting whispers from the past. The cleanup crew. When I got out of high school, finding a job was difficult, so I took whatever horrible jobs I could to get by. When I found a job cleaning fire and water damage full-time, I was excited to have a steady income and start saving. But this quickly turned into a nightmare that I had to endure for almost 2 years. The company I worked for put me on my first job, which was a water damage claim, where a basement flooded with sewage. So after a few days of work, we finished, and it was on to the next job. My boss then called me into his office the next morning and told me about a special crew that he was setting up and asked if I would be the crew leader, supervising 3 other guys that were just hired. I found this strange, as I had only been working there a total of around 3 days, but figured my work ethic was already paying off and I would get a raise. I only made $10 an hour to start. Not only did I not get the raise, but I got no training in the new position other than a work van with cleaning material and the phone numbers for the 3 new guys that also were hired to do fire and water damage cleanup. The boss told me what tools were best to use and what cleaning products to use to sanitize, along with where everything was located in the van with hazmat suits and respirators. But he was vague about what kind of things I would clean up. He just said the situations were always different, and I would get detailed instructions each job. He called my position as CSC crew leader. The boss told me that I would never have to see the deceased, as the coroner would have the remains gone by the time my crew got there, and to use my logic to determine what needed to be removed from the homes and what could be cleaned. The first job I had in my new position, which the boss told me about when I got to the office, was cleaning up the remains of an elderly man or woman who died in their house and had been laying in a chair. When we arrived, the coroner had me come inside to show me a few things that were considered hazardous materials and needed to be removed due to the risk of disease. I guess my boss knew a few people from the county coroner's office, and much of the work came from their recommendations. Not only was the deceased still in the house, but was fully visible to me and the other guy, and you could smell the rot through the masks as the house had no AC. And this was mid-June. The coroner was backed up and waiting on additional people to show up to load the body as it was falling apart. And I called the body because I honestly couldn't tell if it was male or female, and was trying not to look too long as it was disturbing. The other 3 guys I worked with handled it well, but 2 got sick from the smell and had to go outside to puke. We all waited outside after the coroner showed us the chair, the fluids that leaked into the carpet, and the basement where the fluids went through the subfloor and puddled on some boxes in the basement. The coroner's support arrived and took the deceased out. Me and the crew then started working. After about 5 minutes, weird things started to happen. The first of which was when I began to disassemble the chair. C had removed the back of the chair and was putting it into the special hazmat bags that I was given, and the base started to rock when I was about 10 feet away, putting the bag with the back of the chair by the front door. Nobody else was in the same room as the other guys were in the basement dealing with moving boxes. I brushed it off and took apart the base of the chair as much as I could, and when I got it into the bag, I got a chill up my back and then began feeling sick. I just figured it was the shock of what I was cleaning hitting me and pushed on, even though the chill was strange, as I was very hot in full hazmat in June. Next was removing the carpet and assessing the floor to see if it would be able to be cleaned, or if I had to remove a section of the floor, so I called the boss to ask him, and he told me just to pour the special cleaner on the area to soak into the floorboards, and it would be fine. So I got it out of the truck where he said it was and brought it inside. When I got inside, all 3 of the guys in the basement were scrambling to get out of the basement, tripping over each other, and all 3 ran outside. When I asked them what was up, all 3 said there was someone in the basement, and they assumed it was a homeless person or junkie. I listened to one of the open windows in the basement. It's kind of the first thing we did when we started working. Open any window possible, prop the doors open, so maybe someone got inside then, or possibly before we got there and was hiding. After listening for a few minutes and hearing nothing, me and another one of the workers went inside, armed with a mag light and a piece of metal fence post, and searched the basement. Nothing was down there but the footprints of the shoe cover we used, but when we started up the stairs, we heard a horrible hacking cough from somewhere in the basement. When we looked for it, there was nothing, but the corner of the basement had a bunch of dust stirred up like someone was moving things very recently, which weirded us both out. We called the guys back in, and they got back to the boxes, but all of them kept feeling like they were being touched while throwing away material from the boxes that had fluids on them. I went back to my upstairs job, but found that the cleaner I put next to the floorboards was gone. I started getting frustrated, as it was the only jug I had of this cleaner, and I clearly remember it being set next to the area before the guys ran up the stairs and my attention was redirected. I began to take out the trash, figuring I would find it eventually, or the basement guys took it to the floor, and I found it on its side, behind the bag that had the back of the chair. This was impossible. There were like 6 other bags in front of this one near the front door, and this was a gallon bottle of cleaner. Again, I got a chill, but this one was brought on by what sounded like a whisper that I could not make out the words to. Cleaned the floorboards and moved out the trash. The job was complete. That night, each member of my crew had a dream about an older man telling us that we were not welcome in his home, touching his belongings, and that we needed to leave. In my dream, I was alone in his house. The old man cried and told me I was destroying his things and he couldn't replace anything. He was trying to push me out of his house, but it was like I was ignoring him. Even when he would push me and scream at me, no reaction from me. He then threw my cleaner into the garbage pile I had made by the front door, exactly where I found it. 2 of the 3 guys in the crew told me their dreams about the old man pushing them as they went through boxes of ruined pictures and other old stuff that needed to be thrown out due to the risk of disease from his fluids. They also said it was like they had no control and were on autopilot. They said they were so sad but couldn't do anything. The thing that got me about the dreams of the other 2 guys was they both said the man was getting so upset that he began violently coughing, and that the man kept grabbing their arms when they would touch boxes or throw things into the trash. Neither of the guys was in the house when me and the other guy heard the coughing from the basement. Might just be a coincidence, or it might have been something bigger. I don't know. The dorm. When I moved for university, I could tell something was off. Leaving behind the quiet north to live elsewhere in the UK was a shift. Now, I was sharing a home with 4 other girls. Our place was tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, with all the buzz of shops and bars close by. My room was on the ground floor, which used to be a living room but was converted into a bedroom. A standout feature? The massive bay window overlooking the front. Considering our house's setup, no one would be wandering past our front unless they had a reason to be there. I'd only been there 2 weeks when a late-night event rattled me. That night, only one other roommate was home, and her room was upstairs. It was around 2 a.m., and I was sitting in bed watching Netflix. I usually didn't stay up this late, but I was talking to a new guy at the time, and often stayed up very late just to talk to him. New relationships are very exciting. I remember wanting to go to sleep around 12:30 and decided to stay up a little longer just to talk to him. I'm very glad I did. At the time, I was quite naive and didn't really think much about the dangers of not closing doors or leaving windows open. I grew up in a very safe area where we never had to lock our doors, so I wasn't out of this mentality. But this experience definitely changed that. Even though I had one of my windows slightly open and my curtains were open too, the curtains didn't matter much. The way the house was built, the garden and trees were right in front of my window, meaning no one could see in, unless they were standing directly in front of it. Being so naive, I didn't think it was a possibility that anyone would try. I was half lying, half sitting on the bed, with my laptop in front of me. I didn't have my laptop on too high a volume since there was another person in the house, and I wanted to be respectful. Suddenly, I saw a shadow quickly pass by my window as if a person was running past. I immediately froze. As I mentioned, there was no way anyone could pass through that area unless they walked down my driveway and specifically came to our house. Maybe someone had walked the wrong way or was crossing and was going to jump the fence to another house. Something didn't feel right. However, I left my laptop on and looked at the window for just a second. I couldn't see anything outside as it was so dark, but I could make out some kind of shadow on the wall right next to it. For a second, there was nothing. Then the shadow of a man passed by once again. Another shadow, of a different man, followed about 2 seconds later. At this point, I knew something was wrong. I immediately closed my laptop, hoping that if they looked in my window, they wouldn't see me. A little time passed, maybe a minute or two. I sat in total darkness, waiting to see if I could see anything else. After a moment, another shadow of a man passed by my window in the opposite direction. It was as if they had both walked in front of my window towards the back of the house, but only one had returned. At that moment, I was sure something was wrong, but I couldn't act. My brain was trying to process a million things at once, and I was so scared I froze. I felt that if I moved, they would know I was there, and I had no idea if that was a good or bad thing. As far as I knew, they were expecting a 19-year-old girl to be inside. I didn't want to risk letting them know I was aware of their presence. I was also completely naked under the covers, and it crossed my mind that if I got up, someone might look in the window and see me naked. Who knows what they would do then? After what seemed like an eternity of just sitting there, I heard a loud knock on my window. It sounded like someone had hit it with a rock with great force. I assumed they were trying to break it, and I panicked. I can't explain what was going through my mind, but it was almost like I was waiting for something final to happen, as if I was being overly dramatic. After the loud noise, maybe 30 seconds passed. Suddenly, my curtains started moving, and I could see a hand trying to push them aside. I looked and saw the figure of a man entering through my window. He was halfway in, with the upper half of his body already inside my room. That's when my mind finally decided it was a fight or flight situation. I got up and ran to my door on the other side of the room. It was locked, so I had to find the key, turn it, and then open the door and run out while making a huge amount of noise. I ran upstairs and knocked on my roommate's door, still completely naked. I must add that the image she must have had when she opened the door is quite funny to think about. She opened the door almost immediately, which I thought was strange for being 2 a.m., but I was grateful. I told her what happened, and we closed her door and started to panic. Neither of us knew what to do. We had never been in a situation like this before. Being young and a bit naive, I decided to call my mom. She was completely unhelpful in this situation, but I wasn't thinking clearly. She said to call the police immediately. Obviously, we called the police because we didn't know if the men were still in the house or not. They arrived within 2 minutes, as it may have been an active robbery. I had left my laptop and all my belongings in my room, other than my phone. The phone was in my hand when I ran, so if they were in my room, they would have a lot to take away. The police arrived and we threw some keys at them from the upper window so they could enter. They searched the entire house from top to bottom and found no one. I came down when they assured us everything was safe and checked my room. They hadn't taken anything. I knew for a fact that they must have broken in, but my laptop was still there, clear as day on my bed. Surely that would have been the first thing they had taken. The police thought I must have scared them by getting up, as they must not have expected anyone to be home. Maybe they thought the room was just a place to live. It made sense that they would have hoped to rob the house while everyone was sleeping upstairs. I had this crazy thought process through all of this, where I started to wonder if I had really seen what I thought. I began to doubt myself and wonder if I was just crazy. When I went down to check my bedroom window, although it was completely open to its fullest extent, while I had only opened it a small crack at most, this only confirmed that what had happened was completely real. I learned a valuable lesson about leaving the windows open that day. That's for sure. While the police were there, they were radioed about an attempted robbery a couple of blocks from mine, and they suspected it was the same two people. But nothing was said again. They haven't caught them. Unfortunately, they told us that if they caught anyone involved in a similar crime, they would get back in touch. But to this day they haven't. So they have either been caught and are not connected to my case, or they have never been caught. The CSI came the next day and managed to get a fingerprint from my window, but they said the person must have been sweating or something, since the fingerprint was too smudged to get anything out. I am very glad I decided to stay up later. If I wasn't awake for this, they would have been physically in my room when I realized. The thought of waking up to two men in my room is terrifying. I'm not sure what they would have done to me if they had come in before they realized I was there, and there was no easy escape for them. They would have had to go back out through that little window or open my bedroom door and go out the front door. Not to mention the fact that I was naked. I can't bear to think about it. My roommate told me after the police left that she actually woke up for some reason, about 5 minutes before I came flying up the stairs. She said when she heard the loud knock on my window, she was already awake. She had started to get a bad feeling after that. She sat at the end of her bed waiting for me to come upstairs. It's very interesting that she woke up during this, since the men were not making any noise at that moment, other than when the window was hit. Maybe that says a lot about the body's ability to detect danger. Unfortunately, I ended up not being able to sleep in that room without having all the lights on. Shortly after, I decided to return home for college because I felt very uncomfortable living there.
The end. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also, hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.